Welcome to Idea Collider, a regular podcast hosted by me, Mike Rea, where I speak with the people who I regard as the most interesting within the pharmaceutical space, or I talk with the authors of the books that I've found most interesting on the subject of innovation. So enjoy. Another episode of Idea Collider, a set of conversations with the people I regard as the most interesting as it touches on innovation within the pharmaceutical industry. And I'm delighted to welcome John Tsai to this episode of Collider. So, John, could you tell us, who you are and how you got to where you are?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Thanks for inviting me to the show and looking forward to the discussion here. Uh, I lead the Global Drug Development Organization here at Novartis. I'm also the Chief Medical Officer. I've been here for 3 years. And as you asked me about how I got here, Mike, I'm coming here from sunny Los Angeles, working at Amgen prior to this. And maybe a quick short story for us. I had no intentions of ever moving to Basel. In fact, I trained in California and was so happy to get back to California after a 16, 18-year stint in the Northeast and in Europe. And was closing on my house in Southern California when I received a text from Novartis to say, "Hey, would you be interested in looking at the head of development at Novartis?" And I texted back to say, "There's no way I'm moving from California. I just got back." But after having sent that text, they were very convincing in telling me how they were changing the culture and really was aligned with my purpose, which was extending and improving the patient lives. At the same time, really was about the culture that Novartis was embarking on, that Voss was leading. And based on conversations with Voss and many of the executive leaders, here I am 3 years later in Basel and really having the time of my life leading the development organization and also changing the culture here at Novartis.
Mm. And that subject of culture is a fascinating one because, the Novartis that I think we all knew, especially on the sort of SIBA, Sandoz early days of Novartis, the idea of new skills in the science of life, which I know was the kind of the meaning behind the name, has needed a change in culture. So, can you tell us what that's been about and where you are on the journey?
Yeah, I would be happy to do so. And we are on a journey as you've outlined. And before I started even getting back to the story I was telling earlier, the image that I had of Novartis, it was a 150-year-old chemicals company. And I think that's the roots of the company. And when I thought about also the culture was really a top-down culture, Swiss-based company. And that was the image that I had coming in. Then we had the conversations around, well, how would we change that culture to be a people driven and employee driven organization? And that's what we've embarked on. And the three words that we use to describe the culture at Novartis now is unbossed, curious, and inspired. And these are the three that we thrive on in order to ensure that we're excelling and really having a purpose driven organization. We take surveys on a quarterly basis, Mike. So it is a survey that's sent out to every single employee within the organization. It's 10 questions that really track how we're measuring against those three core tenets that we talked about: inspire, curious, and unbossed. And what we've seen over the last 2 years is that the culture continues and the score continues to improve as we are measuring these. So these are the trackings. And while I would say we're nowhere near completion of that journey, I'm not sure we'll ever be completed in our cultural journey, but I think we've made really good strides in that journey of getting to a much more employee driven organization.
Yeah, and I remember Vas introducing that idea of unbossed, and I think for those of us outside Novartis, it was one of those words that, and certainly in the management textbooks, was out there. But could you tell us, what how you define it and how it really works with leadership and the teams?
Yeah, when the concept and the word unbossed was brought up, you could see the frowns on many people's faces, and kind of the double take when you use that word. And a lot of people are asking, what does it really mean? Does it mean that we have the freedom and the flexibility to do whatever we want? And is it a free for all? And so I get to actually work on any project that I would want to. And in fact, it's quite the opposite of that. And what the way that I would define unbossed is ensuring that we set clear goals and ambitions for the organization. It is not an organization without ambitions, and it's probably the exact opposite of that. It's setting very bold ambitions for an organization. And I mentioned, having an organization that to extend and improve patient lives. And that's our bold ambition. And we set specific goals to target that. But at the same time, how you actually get that done is the culture element. And the culture element is if you allow employees and the people on the teams to have more flexibility in how they achieve that goal, they're more inspired. In fact, they are more wanting to achieve those goals. We really saw this during the pandemic, Mike. And, one of the concerns probably for not just people at Novartis, but across all of the world was, well, how will organizations actually accelerate during this time? What we found during the pandemic is that giving the teams the opportunity to have a lot more freedom and flexibility. In fact, it's not about them not wanting to achieve those goals. They feel more accountable and more inspired. And so we started this journey 2 years ago, 2+ years ago. And when the pandemic hit us, the light switch flipped from having everyone being in the office one day and the next day, everyone working from home. We've seen that our productivity actually has increased significantly based on a lot of the efforts and the culture journey that we started a couple of years ago.
That's interesting, and I guess for those who don't keep a track on the statistics, I know within our innovation index, one of the things that stood out in 2019, for example, was you had more FDA approvals than any company has ever had in history. So clearly, I'd be interested in your kind of definitions of productivity, especially as it pertains to innovation.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Thanks for mentioning that. And we're super proud of the fact that we've had 10 new drug approvals in 3 years. And I think that's a record for industry. In 2019, we had 5 new drug approvals. So coming off of a really strong track record of approvals, and certainly culture has a strong element to that. How do we measure productivity? And it comes down to really anchoring on what we think are the core tenets of one, making sure that we not only measure every single step along the way, but really starting at the highest level is to have a purpose-driven organization. So as I said earlier, when we take a highest level to say we measure across the organization in these quarterly surveys, we call it our voice. We measure how people feel that they are being inspired and how we're living to actually motivate the organization and how we're purpose driven as an organization. And in that quarterly survey result, we've seen that score improve, by at least 5 points. And during the pandemic, we've seen that increase by at least 5 points. So a significant increase from the time we started. Now, it's also to say that, within the development organization, we also have specific productivity dashboards and trackers. So one of them being the growth of the transformational therapies that we're bringing forward, because obviously that's really important for us. We also measure the productivity in terms of cycle time, development of our cycle time. So each one of the various specific, tenets we measure. So not only do we measure it at the highest level, but many of the individual elements at the same time.
Interesting. And I'd be interested in how you, so first of all, I guess, do you have a kind of working definition of innovation that, that you can share?
Yeah, innovation, I think, means lots of things for many people. And as I think about innovation, really comes down to the life sciences and how much life sciences has contributed to innovation overall. If I take a step back on just the word and meaning for innovation, and this is what brought me to medicine, in fact, is the life expectancy for human beings about 150 years ago was less than 40 years old for individuals. Fast forward now to 2021, life expectancy is 80, and in some countries in the developed world, over 80 years old. We've doubled that life expectancy. And that's really the innovation that healthcare has brought for individuals. So, what I mean by innovation is really, are we changing the standard of care for patients? Are we improving patient lives? Are we extending patients' lives? And that's the way that I think about innovation, particularly in the life science field.
Yeah. So within your organization, there, I guess inevitably there's a lot of surrogates for productivity. Can you give us a sense for how that dashboard looks when you turn it on in the morning?
Yeah, so we have a couple of dashboards. First, when I take a look at the dashboard, it really comes down to the portfolio that we have, Mike. We're in 8 disease areas. In the development organization, we cover 52 diseases. So it is a large portfolio. And what we're really excited about is how much of the portfolio is really what we classify first in class or first in indication. So for me, if I were to take a step back and I had to describe that to you, I would say, how much of our portfolio is changing the standard of care? Mm-hmm. And when we look at our development portfolio, year on year, we're at or over 90% of our portfolio being first in class or first in indication. That's the first that we measure. So yeah. I would say, as I think about that, that's really important for us as transformational therapies. Second would be in the area of how we look at the value of our portfolio, because obviously you could have a portfolio that is full of transformational therapies, but they're really high risk, because you could take on all the high risk in a portfolio that is looking at really intractable diseases, and then in the very end, not being able to achieve those goals. So the second area that we measure to counterbalance the innovation is also what the value of the portfolio and what we call net present value. So that's the second measure that we have. The third area that we would measure is really productivity. And how do we look at productivity? It's really around cycle time and improving the cycle time. This is the how we get things done. And I would love to show you some of the things that we're doing in terms of cutting the cycle time down. One of the things that, Mike, maybe to take a step and having an analogy to the story that I told earlier about having doubling the life of patients. If you think about one of the major breakthroughs in medicine, which is penicillin, that was, Alexander Fleming back in 1928. It took him 12 years to actually develop that drug from, the petri dish to bring that to mass market to patients. Well, you fast forward, now we're in 2020, 90 years later, so almost 100 years later. The cycle time for development of drugs is just slightly less than 10 years. Right. So despite all the innovation that we talk about, clinical development of drugs has barely moved from 12 years down to slightly less than 10 years. I think there is so much opportunity, Mike, to actually decrease that. So that's something that we're also measuring is how do we actually improve the timelines for bringing drugs to patients? So that's probably the third measure that we would have. And then obviously we measure our reputation, ESG scoring. Those are also really important. But at least I'll leave you with those 3 major areas that we track ourselves in terms of how we measure our goals.
Interesting. No, the penicillin story is one of those sort of fascinating ones of both linear and also, I'm going to say, serendipitous sort of development, right? Finding, was it cantaloupes or something in the local area that that had a better sort of strain, but wanting to go looking for that. And I think one of the things that struck me, I think the last time I heard you talk, was you talk about your ability at a glance to be able to ask questions of your data. Could you remind listeners of what you have at your fingertips and how you use it as a learning process?
Yeah, and this really goes to the goal of what we were talking about, Mike, is improving the cycle times for drug development. So there's two components. We call this data and digital. Maybe I'll touch upon the digital aspect first, and then we'll come back on the data aspect, because there's so much opportunity here to be able to bring those to improve cycle times for drug development. On the digital front, what we saw is, in terms of the operations or how we conduct clinical studies, the way that we conduct clinical studies is the way that we've been doing it for the past 30 or 40 years. We have a drug, we bring them into phase 1 clinical studies, ensuring the safety. Then we do dose ranging, you recruit in your phase 3 clinical studies, and you go out and you get various sites and patients recruited into clinical studies. And you test them, and successful, then you register with the FDA. Well, for the majority, and you probably know this, Mike, less than 5% of patients who want to be in clinical trials actually enroll in clinical trials based on the logistics. So the first step that we took using digital capabilities, and this was, actually started when Vas was in the role as the head of development, was to say, how do we actually simplify that process? And we used internally what we call the internal brain, which is NerveLive platform, to be able to figure out, well, which sites are the best recruiting sites, which of where can we actually find all of the patients, and how do we ensure that we optimize that process for clinical trial conduct. So that's been advanced with NerveLive as the brain. Sense is our platform, and I'll have the team send you a photo of this. We started this journey 3 years ago, and now what we're able to do is we're able to see where patients are being recruited at every single site around the world. We have 100,000 patients recruited into our clinical studies. I can tell you real time where those patients are. I can tell you which sites are recruiting, which sites are not recruiting. How do we actually dial up and down and even adjust based on COVID what the impacts are? And having that as the platform for digital has really accelerated and helped us during this COVID pandemic, because we've been able to shift our recruitment of our clinical studies during this time. So I would say that's probably just the start of improving processes, and using that NerveLive as the platform, we've extended that to looking at how we forecast our clinical trials, where our supplies are. We're actually using this in technical operations. We're using this in terms of how much budget we have for our overall clinical studies. We're looking at this in finance. So that, I could see all the tentacles from, and I'm happy to share with you how we're extending that. One last step on the digital front, and I haven't even gotten to the data part, Mike. On the digital front, now we're taking one step further to employ AI in how we improve clinical trials and clinical studies. And what do I mean by AI? Well, there's multiple components of AI, but now we're looking at how complex are our protocols in terms of conducting our studies. So are we collecting too much information? Is it that the patients do need to come in every 6 weeks, or can they actually come in every 12 weeks? So we're working and partnering with Microsoft in a project called Protocol AI to see how we could have the simplest protocols so we can simplify the way that we conduct our clinical trials. And the aim is to actually decrease cycle time of our clinical studies by 33%. So that's one of about 10 AI projects in development. We're actually extending that in what we call technical research and manufacturing, and how we do the technical aspects of CMC manufacturing and formulations. That's one aspect of this. So that's just the digital component, Mike. And I'm happy to talk about data, but you can see that we have lots going on, and the end goal here is really to take that cycle time of drug development from 12 years down to 9, and hoping to go even half that to 6 years in time.
Which is really appealing. I like that idea of and this is where the curiosity comes through, right? The kind of purposeful curiosity of setting out to learn how to improve. Because I guess there's two ways. There's the way that some pharma does it, which is we've always done it this way, and we're pretty comfortable doing it this way, and there's very little risk if we were to continue doing it. But you're saying we're going to use a feedback loop. So we've got to have some sensors out there. We've got to have a feedback loop that tells us something about how to do this differently. So is that new? Is that something that's recent, or that you've introduced, or is it been part of a continuing journey?
Certainly is an evolution, Mike, and maybe I'll tie this back to the conversation we were having around unbossed, because you can imagine, working in various organizations in the past, what we would set as goals. We would actually bring 10 transformative therapies, and this is the way that you actually have to achieve that goal. So the teams would go off. What would they do? Well, the teams would actually copy and paste the protocols and to say, well, let's see how we can move faster. Let's actually have more sites. Give me more money, because if I have 10 times the amount of sites, I can recruit much faster. This is a different approach than that, which is to take a step back and ask the teams, how would you actually improve and design a trial with a blank sheet of paper? How would you go about doing that in advancing, whether that would be oncology and bring a therapy for patients with breast cancer? And we saw a really good example of this, Mike, during COVID-19, because when the pandemic hit us in March, I think everyone was scrambling to say, what are the therapies that are out there that might work for patients? Typically for us to take a concept to actually having a protocol fed back from the FDA and start recruitment and trials at the fastest pace, it would be 9 to 12 months. So we looked at our entire portfolio and we said, well, which of the agents, anti-inflammatory, antiviral agents in our development library, could we use, and how quickly can we actually get a study up and running? We got 3 studies up and running, one in canakinumab, one in ruxolitinib, and one in hydroxychloroquine, in a matter of 4 to 6 weeks. So you compare that, 12 months versus 4 to 6 weeks, and we essentially just let the teams go. We said, you have all the resources. This is what our goals are, is to get this up and running. We need feedback from the FDA. Let's make sure that these are well-controlled randomized trials. And within 4 weeks, the hydroxychloroquine study was up and running. And then the ruxolitinib study was up and running in 6 weeks. So, this is record time for how we were able to achieve that.
It's impressive, that kind of growth mindset is clearly been driven into those teams. So I want to give you the chance to talk about data too, but I kind of like it. And so, do you see this as a kind of important feedback loop for you? I guess this ability to almost do A/B testing of sites and approaches.
Yeah, we certainly feel like this is a critical element for us, because not only do we have the analytics tools and making sure that we have the data so we know how we would conduct our clinical studies, now you also have the component of the individuals on the teams that are inspired to say, hey, I have the flexibility to try some new things. I will go out of the box. And one of the areas that I didn't mention earlier is looking at digital endpoints. Mm-hmm. So, there's with the recent pandemic, I think the regulators are even more open now to looking at digital endpoints, digital ways of recruitment for patients. So having that, the teams are taking a step back to say, how do I employ those technologies, and whether that would be in ophthalmology where we could use OCTs and use your smartphones to be able to measure some of these endpoints. Another example would be in Sjogren's syndrome, where there's really been no good measures for patients as endpoints, and the FDA is struggling to say, how do we actually improve? So there's been really no advancement in Sjogren's syndrome. I think these are some of the things that we're doing, is unbossing the teams at the same time, pushing the boundaries on technology so that we can bring treatments for patients.
And it's something, maybe this is about you and your leadership. Because one thing that I've been talking about, this idea of asymmetric learning organizations and dealing with uncertainty, it's a challenge for some leaders, right? Because I think the traditional pyramid structures of organizations, where the guy at the top says this will work or this won't, and this is what we're going to do and this is what we're not, you're almost revealing the opposite of that, which is comfort with uncertainty, comfort with learning, something that you didn't know yesterday. How do you kind of tie the leadership with that sort of vulnerability, if you like?
And this has been a learning journey for me, Mike. I'll tell you just a quick, simple story. Maybe that'll probably tie the two together. My undergraduate degree is in electrical engineering. So my first job after I completed my degree in electrical engineering was to work for GE. And they threw me to the wolves, and they asked me to lead, actually be the foreman of a union. And you remember back in the late 1980s, unions were so strong that I was a young, 22-year-old on the factory lines, and I had around 60 union employees working for me. And it was a top-down approach. Hey, and I was working for GE Medical Systems, where we had to build 6 CT scanners and 4 MRI scanners by the end of the week. Every week with 6 CT scanners and 4 MRI scanners. And when I started that role, Mike, what I would do, I got on the shop floor and I would say, look, guys, this is what we need to do. And I thought, a team approach, since I'm used to playing sports, I would say, this is what we need. And they would look at me like, hey, who is this young person coming and telling me what to do? And the productivity dropped significantly because they were actually quite resistant to that, having a young person telling them what to do. So over the course of time, I got to know the employees on the floor, and I got to know their children and talk to them to say, hey, here's the value. If you guys can manufacture and produce 6+4, this is the value for us. We would be the winning team. This is our rewards for us. And we had really open conversations. It was probably the easiest job at the end, Mike, based on that. So it's really just inspiring the teams to be able to do the work instead of setting hard goals. And like I said earlier, if I came in and led the organization and said, hey, we need 10 transformational therapies, I think we would probably get half the amount. But if you unleash the inspiration and the curiosity within the teams, you get double the amount. And that's always something that's stuck with me. And it's not easy to just kind of take a step back. But ultimately, I do think the responsibility as to be the team leader is to remove obstacles for the teams. Let's set ambitious goals for the teams, but remove obstacles so people can do their work. And that's what really has been inspiring and driven me.
No, and kudos, because I think that it's hard to not be the kind of chief knowledge officer of a company, but to be the kind of chief curiosity officer is, I think that's a really important step. But I want to give you a chance to talk about data as well, and your kind of access to data across that dashboard.
Yeah, and I think the analytics power, thanks for bringing us back to the data piece, because I have such a strong yearning for the data piece too, Mike. I think the analytics power of what we've seen in technology advancements has gotten to the point that I believe this is really going to help us in terms of advancing drug development over the course of time. When we started to look at data here at Novartis, we knew that we had lots of data that was collected from our previous clinical studies. Over the last 5 years, we have 2 million patient years of patient lives of data of information that we collected. And we said, well, we need to put that to good work so that we can actually improve how we develop drugs. So we put that in a data lake called Data 42, and it took us 9 months, and it was hard work. Anyone that tells you this is easy work, it's really hard work because most of the data that's out there is pretty dirty. We had to make sure that we align all of the fields. We have all of the lab data now, genomics data, we have radiographic data, all in this lake, and we call that Data 42. And we're extending that now. We have the ability through, well, now the next step of it is called Map of Life. So if you ask me how many patients from your cardiovascular disease trials have non-small cell lung cancer, within 3 seconds, probably even less than 3 seconds, I can tell you how many patients within that group have rotator cuff tendonitis. We can tell you. So now you get to interrogate that. And it's not just the power now, but it's the power building on from this point, because I think having that information will only make us smarter in that feedback loop to say, is it that one of the anti-inflammatories, is it that IL-6 will work for this indication? While that won't tell us the exact answer, I can tell you that it will be much easier to stop projects that may not have value. And in itself, just that objective will have achieved our goals using the data that we have.
Which is interesting, because I guess two questions follow. One is who's coming up with the questions, and I think the other is clearly an organization that has that kind of a lake, that kind of insight, will build on its success as it goes. I think that so. Who are the people asking questions of the lake? Is that you, or do the teams have their own curiosity there?
Yeah, such a simple question, but such a hard question to answer. So we actually sat as a steering committee to ask that question, to say who should have the ability to interrogate this lake. And I'll just make a long story short. We put it in the hands of the scientists and all the individuals. So it is not, only 3 people have the ability to ask. We have it on the desktops of all the individuals to be able to ask questions. I will take a step back and to say we're going to have to train them, because we have to train them on asking the right questions. Otherwise, garbage in is garbage out, as you know, Mike. So what we're doing is we're making sure that people understand the power of this. But it is within the hands of all of the scientists, and we have 26,000 scientists in our R&D organization. So it's going to be in their hands to be able to interrogate this lake, which is where the power is.
And that's some network to be able to wield, right? I guess the way that those 26,000 asked questions is going to be instructive in its own manner.
Absolutely, and we're looking forward to it. Maybe in a couple months, I'll let you know. We're just starting off on that journey because we now have all of the data dropped in and in fields ready to explore. And the analytics power, Mike, just getting the data into the lakes is one step. But the step beyond that is, how do you actually have an overlay in the platform so that we can actually have the analytics ability to interrogate that information? That was also a challenge in itself. And we worked closely with external forces to be able to drive that solution. And I'm so happy to see, and hopefully in a couple months, I'll be able to tell you how that's coming along.
Interesting. No, I think that, already, if I would summarize it, your ability to set goals, to set, ideal outcomes, and then to go looking for technology that would support that, feels like the right way around. I think that often it's the inverse of that, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it goes back, I was saying earlier, really comes down as we measure. You can't just have productivity measures for the sake of productivity. It really has to tie to the overall vision. Yeah. So for us, this is the productivity piece that will actually decrease our cycle times for how we develop drugs. And if we could decrease that cycle time, also translates into more transformative therapies. More transformative therapies in the end means improving and extending patient lives. So those are the connections that we make. And if you can actually look at how that's tied to, then the individuals can see the value that they're bringing, because they often can know that they have a real that they are very close to the purpose. Now you can draw that linear line from where you started all the way to the end.
Yeah, yeah, and I like that. It linked back to that definition of innovation as well, which is that the people who bring the cantaloupe are at least as important in getting the penicillin launched as the people that came up with the idea in the first place. But and that's where an organization is more potent than the individual. But in the interest of time, I know we've got to start sort of coming into a close. I'd be interested. We've got some hint, I think, of what drives you personally. But what is it that what on January 4th? What was the thing that you most look forward to doing?
So many things. I'll tell you, maybe there are four cornerstones, and I refer to the cornerstones of how I actually, that's what drives me on a daily basis. And these are the four things that I think about on a regular basis. One is, and you've heard this, is around purpose. Having an impact on people's lives and patient lives, and what I actually quantify as pioneering for life. That's one of the cornerstones for me. Second is really around being a good leader. And, my role within the organization is really being a good leader, ensuring that we inspire the individuals within the organization. These are the two things that are the two cornerstones that probably are more slanted towards the professional side. Then on the personal side, there are two also cornerstones that I live by, Mike, which is one, it's a combination of being a loving husband and a good father. So that for me is something that's really important. And fourth is giving back to the community. So those are really the four cornerstones that I live by. And early in my career, Mike, one of the things that I had, because I was so close to my job, and it was hard for me at times to walk away from work because I was so close to having, thinking about work all the time. So I used these as my four cornerstones of life, two being more professional, two being more personal. And on a regular basis, people have their notebooks, and I have a notebook that I jot down. I give myself a scoring, to be a little quirky. I give myself a scoring system of 1 to 5, and I track these to say, how am I doing? I don't do this every day, but I do it on a regular basis, and I track how I'm progressing. And it's been really helpful. I know you talked about measures and measurements, and being an engineer, you probably can see that I measure these things, but it does help me to say, hey, I'm a little bit out of tilt in terms of maybe not focusing on being a good leader or not focusing as much on the family, and making those adjustments along the way. And having these four cornerstones, Mike, and just tracking them has given me peace of mind to allow me to walk a little bit away from work at times, because I have to dial that to the, you could see kind of how I would dial that more towards the family, or dial it more in terms of giving back to the community. And that's how I really live my life.
I'm not surprised by that, by the tension between the four. I guess there's a sort of natural tension between those four. Interested, that must also be a corporate cultural approach as well to enable that, because some companies in your role would be dialing up one of those cornerstones more than the others.
Yeah, I've worked in organizations which was highly dialed up on work. You can send an email on Sunday morning at 5 a.m. and then you would have 10 responses back. And that's certainly not the approach that we take here. I think, people need downtime, and people need to refresh, recharge. And that's really been a critical element, because if you're not inspired and you can't bring your best self to work, then you actually don't have an organization that actually achieves its purpose. So we are ensuring that we have the right balance we make sure that we are investing in our people, making sure that the teams bring their best selves to work. And the way to do that is to make sure that they have a good balance between the professional aspects and the personal aspects. And, during just this recent holiday break, when we say it's a shutdown for the organization, it really shuts down. Like, you can count on your hand the number of emails that are exchanged, unless there's a safety issue, obviously, for
Yeah.
patients. But other than that, it really shuts down and lets people get that rest, recovery, and then come fully refreshed and with a new 2021.
No, I think it's healthy, and you'd think this is an industry where people would feel connected to that purpose on a Monday morning, right? Because if it becomes a grind, you think, well, you are working on cures for cancer, and this is why you get on a plane to JP Morgan typically, and so forth. So maybe a couple of questions just to maybe go away from Novartis a little bit. Are there books, because we do a book club podcast alongside this. Are there books that you would recommend to anyone that would like to know more, where your thinking has come from, or that have inspired you?
Yeah, so there have been a couple of books, and I try to read a little bit of everything. So the most recent book that I read is Spillover, and this is, I don't know if it's by David Quammen, and it is about how there has been transmission of diseases from animals to humans, and it gives you a real awakening of how these transmissions occur. And I think it will inspire you to actually even accelerate drug development if you read that book. So that's probably where I would start in terms of, just on the cornerstone of the pandemic. Leadership books, obviously, there's been a handful of leadership books. What's the most recent leadership book that I've read? Nothing comes to mind right off the top of my head here, Mike, in terms of leadership books. But I don't know. Has there been anything that jumped out at you in terms of leadership books?
There's been a bunch. I think it sounds like you should be writing your own rather than pulling from someone else. I think that it's been one of those fields where most of what you're going to read in the first chapter. That's that kind of category of leadership books, right? But I guess just the sort of final question is, this has been a journey for 3 years. Where do you see, you and this role in the next 5?
Yeah, well, I'm having so much fun now that I think, a couple of years down the road, what I would really like to see is for us to continue to advance transformational therapies, Mike. So I take a snapshot 4 or 5 years from now, and we talked about ensuring that we unboss our teams and to bring the power of all the individuals and the great scientists. So I could see us bringing new therapies in so many areas, whether that would be in oncology and improving patient lives with non-small cell lung cancer or breast cancer. I could see us in gene therapy, and I think this is an area that will advance significantly, is gene therapy. While we've made advancements for spinal muscular atrophy, I think there are a number of rare diseases that I think probably we'll see the fruition of within the next 4 to 5 years of improving. And really, this would be transformational. And oftentimes with gene therapies, they are cures for these patients. So I'm really excited about that. I'm excited about cell therapies. We have Kymriah in our portfolio, and I think, when I last looked at the snapshot, there were like 300 cell therapies out there. And I think cell therapies will get much simpler and improve patients' lives in that area. So in every one of our disease areas, I'm hoping that we will have a transformational therapy for patients, whether that's in respiratory, cardiovascular disease, you name it. That's what I'm excited about, Mike.
Wonderful. John, all I can say is thank you so much. If people want to find out more about you, is it best to go through the Novartis website, I guess? And
Certainly. And Novartis website is there. And what I can do is I can share myself and my team's contacts so we can have anyone get in touch, and happy to talk about
I appreciate it. I'll put that in the show notes. John, thank you so much for taking part in this episode.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Mike. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Idea Collider. If you would like to know more, there are a few playlists on YouTube that you can look for, or you can find us on the usual podcast platforms. If there is anything that you'd like to hear more of, please do email me. I'm mike@ideapharma.com. I'd love to hear your suggestions or for content or for really any other approach to what we're doing. Thank you.